thank you everybody for coming to our practice clinic today, Making Sustainable Architecture Work. We've got a fantastic panellist here today. I am Becky Smith. I am the Regional Director for RIBA West Midlands and also a qualified architect. And today we're joined by, I'll let them introduce themselves because they'll give themselves justice that I probably won't. But if I go round the screen to start at the top corner, if I start at Philippa, if you could introduce yourself first, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Philippa Birchwood. I am Director of Thrive at Chetwoods. I'm a qualified architect, a well-accredited professional, mouthful, and I have a seconded role with the UK Green Building Council as their rep for the West Midlands.
Thank you, Philippa. And Hattie, if I could come to you.
Yes, I'm Hattie Hartman. I am Sustainability Editor at the Architects Journal. I worked for many years as an architect, and now I've also worked for many years as a journalist, and I've been covering this topic now for more than 10 years, and it's just fascinating and fabulous to see how this whole topic has risen to the top of the agenda in the last 2 years. For so long, I felt like I was talking to a wall. We still have a long way to go. And I'm delighted to be here and to see the RIBA hosting panels of this type in the regions.
Thank you, Hattie. And Judit, you're next on my screen, so if I could come to you.
Hi, I'm Judit Kimpian. I chair the Architects Council of Europe's Sustainable Architecture Work Group. I work with over 46 EU architectural chambers to promote policy that would help transform the opportunities for design to deliver net zero buildings, and also sit on lots of different groups like the World GBC's Leaders Forum, and work with different ministries to transform the policy framework. I also teach at UCL as part of the Bartlett School of Planning, and developing net zero curriculum with the Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And it was amazing because we lined up a really amazing group of experts, and something like we were doing this in person at the time, and there were something like 15 people attending. I feel for your comment, Hattie, that we've really come a long way, haven't we? It's exciting.
Well, definitely. We've got so far in here today, just listening to our conversation, we've got 112 people, so that's definitely more than that initial one. And last but not least, if I could come to you, John.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Christophers, and I think I have enough grey hairs now to think of myself as a pioneering green architect. I've been doing it, or trying to do it, for 30 years plus now, with a string of green buildings, including, I'm pleased to say, the UK's first ever house, which was accredited as Passive House and Zero Carbon. We did a string of buildings 10 years ago. I've worked at Associated Architects as a director and associate partner for many years, but I'm now working freelance, calling myself Zero Carbon House, and I'm speaking to you from my own Zero Carbon House that we finished in 2009, part of which is new build, part of which is retrofit. Delighted to be here, and you know, it's such a refreshing change from a few years ago where an event like this might have attracted only one or two.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was on mute then. Great. Thank you so much, John, and definitely great to be part of this conversation as well. And you know, this session is called Making Sustainable Architecture Work, and that is the title of the book that was done by Judit and Hattie. So we've got actually a discount code today for anybody who is attending this session to get £7 off that book as well. And we'll post the link to the book in the chat and the code, but it is EPB7 if anybody can't get access to the chat for any reason, and all in capitals. And it is available from midnight well, midnight last night till midnight tomorrow, so you can use it for the 24-hour period. And I would just like to say, if anybody that's joined since we sort of originally started, if you could just turn off your mic and your cameras just to keep a focus on our panelists here today, that would be great. We had some fantastic questions submitted in advance of this session, and we've tried to sort of group them so we could start the conversation, but please feel free to post your questions in the chat. And we can answer those, or post them, raise your hand if you can't get access to the chat for any reason. I think somebody said my camera's off, but it's switched on, so sorry if you can't see me. I'll try and sort that out whilst we start the first conversation. So we sort of looked at what had been asked in advance, and we thought the first topic we could discuss is sort of timescales, and when is the best part of a project to start discussing sustainability. And I think I know the answer, but I think I'm going to come to sort of our panelists first. Does any of you like to kick off the conversation with that one first?
I think we can probably say unanimous right at the very beginning.
Stage 0, absolutely.
Yeah, I think it was emphasised earlier in a talk at the AJ Summit. I think it's stage 0 is when you should consider sustainability. Yeah.
Definitely. And you know, it being inherent, I think, John, sorry.
Go on.
No, I think it being an inherent part of the scheme and not just discussing it at any certain point. I think there's not a certain point, and I don't know if anybody sort of agrees with me then on that.
I would like to say that, you know, for much of the last decade that I've been writing about this, I've spent a lot of my time talking to services engineers. And I was very interested when quite a few years, and Judit will know about this, Foster and Partners bought in a whole practice of service engineers to have them in-house. And they used to tell me, you know, well, before anything is drawn, this needs to be considered. And what's interesting now is, with all the focus on embodied carbon, structural engineers also at the front of this debate. And the tough thing is that, particularly in small projects, a client's not going to be able to afford all these consultants straight away. So we, as architects, need to be on top of these issues. And I don't know, you know, if one of you would like to add a bit more about, you know, how you skill up and how you know what to ask and how you know what to focus on right at the beginning.
I think I can tell a little story. When I was at Associated Architects, Leicester University came to us and they wanted to do a zero carbon building. That was the brief. So we thought, wow, this is fantastic. We've never had a client who's wanted to do this before, and I appreciate that's unusual. But what we then did was we unpacked it, and in fact we ended up doing what turned out to be the UK's largest passive house building. We didn't do a zero carbon building, but I think the key point I'd like to get over is interrogate the brief. Sometimes one is given a brief, and sometimes you know that has to be it for various reasons. But I think much more often, I think there's the scope to interrogate that brief and to say, look, what if X, Y, Z, to look at different scenarios for embodied carbon, energy, and renewables and so forth, and really to look at a whole range of options so that you can interrogate that brief at stage 0, because that's where there's the maximum impact you can make to that project by getting the ground rules right. And you know, if for instance you say, okay, you know, we want to get the fabric right first and we're not going to put the renewables on now, but we'll make sure that they could be retrofitted later, then you know, I think it's getting the strategy right. And it may not be the brief as initially presented. More often than not, in my experience, is not quite the right brief. And you interrogate it. You sort of like a terrier. You chase out the options until you find what is actually the right thing to go for.
Yeah. Also, if you can agree with the client upfront about what you're aiming for, then it's much easier to design for those aims and document how you're actually delivering them. And then if you do get an opportunity, first of all, it's easier to incorporate in the contractor's prelims, and also easier to follow up once the building is completed. And And we were just saying earlier how, how can architects really rise to this? And one of the big messages of the book that Rebecca just mentioned, Energy People Buildings book, is that if you start early, the cost of doing all the feedback is so much lower. And also you learn from every project. So the best way to learn and increase your skills and understanding is to do a little bit more with every project and take the time to do the feedback and learn. In my experience, when working for a large practice and doing this on live projects, was the best lesson for every team was visiting the buildings and understanding what worked well and what didn't. It was better than any CPD you can get your hands on.
I'm hoping we'll be able to visit buildings soon so we can do that as well, which is which is the hard thing at the moment. But definitely, you learn so much more from seeing it than you do sort of on paper, and knowing the inherent benefit as well, which I think is the good thing. We talk a lot about standards, and Philippa, you're a well-accredited professional, and we get the BREEAM. Some people want a BREEAM, passive house, different standards out there. Are there better standards than others? Do some buildings lend themselves better to some standards and not? Our different clients may know different standards and not others. Is there a way of getting over these sort of different standards to the client to explain them better? Philippa, I'll probably kick off with you because you can then explain the well accreditation as well.
So, I mean, the well accreditation probably comes from the fact that, we actually do quite a lot of work in the logistics sector, and it seems to be pushed really hard in that particular sector because they really need to demonstrate they're looking after their workforce. But I would say in terms of accreditation, I mean, I went through it. It was brilliant. I absorbed lots of knowledge, but I would say the best thing to do is be just aware of the principles of all of them. Just be aware of the principles and then take those principles and then apply those as a first port of call, rather than go after it just because of the badge. Because I think as architects, we need to be aware of these themes, so we don't end up getting tangled up at stage 3 or something, potentially, when we figure out that BREEAM 2018 is required for planning, and it's halfway through stage 3, and so therefore the result is ticking a few boxes that might not actually be relevant for the building, but you end up doing it because just to get that badge. So I've done the well certification exam, and I've learned a lot from it, and I would say whether we go for a well certified building or not, or design one, I want to take those principles and apply them on every building.
Definitely. We hear a lot about BREEAM. BREEAM is something that has been inherent in when I used to design schools and universities, we need to achieve BREEAM excellent or BREEAM very good or BREEAM outstanding, and it sometimes get links to funding streams as well. So that is, the reason for going for it inherently in a job. But should it be the reason that you go for it? Is there something better, and can we advise our clients better on those standards as well?
This is a really interesting debate. In one of the office buildings that I worked on, Kimpian Civic Centre, we actually devised a form of performance contracting for operational energy use, and almost managed to include operational embodied carbon as well, but the client, instead of opting for BREEAM, just wanted to understand how much energy he can save on their new premises compared to their the buildings that they consolidated in this new building, and the client was very keen to understand what the maintenance and operating costs will be of this new development. So having an operational energy use target was a no-brainer for them. And in terms of BREEAM, it was all kind of sensible measures, but it really depends on the client's priorities, but what I would recommend is to look at the RIBA's climate challenge benchmarks and use those benchmarks as much as possible to understand what implications achieving those would have for your project. And then think, and on top of that, you can adopt any kind of sustainability rating as well as common sense in terms of what would bring the best architectural quality to your end users. What would make the building last really long.
Mm-hmm. And that's it, isn't it? It's making that building last, you know, making it still be there in 50, 100 years time, if that's how long, not 10 years down the road when
or if it's supposed to be a temporary build, it's designing for disassembly or designing for it to be able to be put somewhere else at a later date.
Definitely. If there's anybody that's just joined recently, could I just ask you to pop yourselves on mute and turn your cameras off if you're not part of the panelists? That would be great, just so we can see our panelists in full on the screen and keep the focus there. Thank you. Judit, you mentioned then the RIBA Climate Challenge, 2030 Climate Challenge, which leads into that quite nicely. John, I know you've talked about the climate challenge before, and I know Associated Architects are signed up to the challenge as well when you were there. And I think we've highlighted recently that it is about having a go, that not necessarily you sometimes you can't meet all those standards, sometimes you haven't got the clients that are allowed to do it, but actually the climate challenge and this 2030 challenge that we're aiming at enables you to have a go at certain principles that can then set things in motion for going forward.
Absolutely, and I think it's really great that that there is, because there's in my view an absence of sufficiently high quality government policy in the area of building standards at the moment, that it is very confusing that there are a plethora of different standards. The Letty standard, the AECB standard, passive house, 3 different passive house standards, etc., etc. But I think what the RIBA Climate Challenge standards have done is to pull together a lot of the work that's been done in different areas. So many of you may be familiar with it. If you're not, I warmly commend you to have a look at it. But for instance, if you look at the work that the UK Green Buildings Council did about a couple of years ago now, to define what does net zero mean, what are we trying to measure? That was, I think, a really valuable piece of work with lots of industry consultation. What the UK GBC didn't do was to say, and these are the metrics you need to get to. And I think that's where the two come together, so that the RIBA Climate Challenge 2000, for instance, if you look at the embodied energy targets, the RIB is saying that we need to sort of have a reducing scale of embodied carbon that goes down, I think, from 600 to 450 to 300, which is the metric is kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square metre of building. So it's the amount of carbon which is locked up in that building. And the RIBA has set a sort of trajectory to say by 2030, we need to get all our buildings designed to this standard. And so it's brought together embodied carbon, operational carbon, some of the things which are really only covered peripherally in different areas, like, for instance, formaldehydes and VOCs, where I think there's some stuff in BREEAM about that, but the RIBA have included that, water usage and so forth. So I think it's a holistic thing. It's not just a sort of thing that says, okay, tons of CO2 or one particular metric. It's a holistic thing. And I think that the other key thing to understand is that if you can't do everything on a project, what the RIBA is trying to do is to at least to get us to report and get back the information, because I think in many of these areas there isn't yet a sufficient body of evidence as to what's happening. There are some pioneering buildings, and then it's the building regulations, and then there are many buildings which actually are performing 60% worse than the building regulations. So I think even if you can't get to a particular standard, I think it's really important not to underestimate the importance of just feeding back the data, so that we compile a whole sort of a whole picture of what's going on, and we help each other to do better.
Definitely, it's like climate benchmarking. and it can help us all sort of do better and see where we, you know, and if there are people meeting those standards in buildings that we don't expect them to be, you know, how they do it, and then how we can all do it, and helps us improve as a profession as well. I think that's really important. Sorry, Hattie.
But yeah, I would like to say that, you know, I think all these different certifications have really pushed the agenda forward when you think in the last 30 years how far we've come. But there's no substitution for good common sense as you look at these. And I think that's what we've all been saying, that, you know, you've got to kind of keep the whole big picture in mind, and even on a small residential project, look beyond the brief of what the client's actually asking you for. I mean, I was on a panel discussion earlier where someone from Mass Design was saying, you know, we were asked to look at this building and do this very high performing building, but there was a huge garage that was being built at the same time as part of this project. This was in Toronto. They managed to go to planning and get the parking requirements for the project changed. So that's, you know, looking way beyond the brief. Another, I think, example that many of you may know because they've now won the Pritzker Prize, but Lacaton and Vassal, but they were asked to look at a public square in Bordeaux and, you know, how to regenerate this public square. And they said, this square doesn't need anything at all. The best thing is to do nothing. So, you know, I think you have to start from first principles, which doesn't mean that this is a highly technical subject. And that's where the book that Judit and I have just been working on comes in, because you can learn so much by going back and visiting projects. And, you know, something as simple as getting the energy bills for 12 months for 3 years can teach you a huge amount. And I know that Archetype, I don't know if they still do it, but Archetype in the early days, they made everyone who joined their staff read the energy bills for a few months, you know, to be sure you understand the units. And it's crazy, but it's important. You know, it can only become second nature if you work with these numbers. And I think as architects, we have a bit of a phobia, so we need to get over that.
Definitely. We definitely have a phobia of it. If I could just ask anybody that's joined recently to turn off their camera. I don't know, Carol, if you've got your camera on, if you could just switch it off, and John on there, that would be great, just to get the panelists as in focus as possible. And that sort of leads me on a little bit to well, we've talked briefly about the RIBA stages of work and how sort of sustainability is integral to that now, and it was sort of an overlay before, and actually how sustainability should be integral into the project now, not just an overlay as it sort of was sort of previously. And, you know, we had some questions about checklists and how do we get into a sort of, you know, creating a checklist for your practice, or things that we should be doing, or things that we should be asking the client, and where can we get that information from, and apart from your book, of course. I don't know if anybody wants to start with that at all.
Who's going to take this one? I can.
Go on. I'll start just very briefly, because I think what you've said is important. That the RIBA work stages now, the plan of work actually includes a checklist at each stage of the project. So, you know, I won't go on. I'll pass it on to other panelists, but I think that's a really good starting point. And then obviously there are project specific things you can add in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm presuming that, you know, most practices will have, hopefully, someone that's designated a little bit to keep in touch with the latest updates at the bare minimum, in which case, you know, the same way that we'd be in touch with things like, you know, building regulation updates, we should be in touch with, you know, legislation updates and industry best practice. So, I mean, that obviously as a baseline is a good place to then be able to determine what questions should be asked at what stage. And, you know, whilst we've got the checklist, you know, for the obviously the RIBA work stages, I'd say probably the three key areas for asking those questions would be obviously at stage 0. The other one would be probably, well, you've got got planning stage, so there's a bit you'd have to respond to obviously whatever the local policy is there. But I'd say the next sort of big questioning area would be at technical stage, so stage 4, where you are specifying materials. We've got a big responsibility on our hands to kind of hold manufacturers to account in terms of what they actually share, what information they're sharing about their materials at the moment. Obviously, we're all looking at fire regulations a lot more closely now, but there's also things, John's mentioned about VOCs, things like that, making us, we need to be a bit more aware of the understanding of our materials. And then obviously Judit and Hattie have talked about sort of stage 7, the post-occupancy asking questions. I'd say those would be the 3 key areas. And as long as we've got some good questions there to ask, I think that would help. And obviously it would just be a case of staying engaged with things like ACAN and UK Green Building Council, and then hopefully we'll have a bit more confidence about what questions to ask, because I mean that's where I've got the majority of my knowledge, is just through networking and attending these events. And you'll probably find that after a few events, quite a lot of the similar themes pop up. I mean, I don't know what you guys think of the rest of the panel, but I mean, you do get to a point where, we reach a point where we're talking about quite similar things again and again. So I think it's quite daunting at the beginning, but as soon as you dip a toe in and engage with events and things out there, it should become a lot clearer.
And that's the thing, it is a learning process, isn't it? And I sort of said when we chatted the other day that actually sustainability or climate literacy or whatever it was called on my architecture course was sort of a 10 credit module that was sort of, and it was added on. You'd done this big design scheme and now do your 10 credit module and make it sustainable. And it's like, and so we've learned that way. So actually, it's hard to then think about it in the reverse, that actually sustainability needs to come at the forefront and then we, inherently put it together. So I think it is a learning curve, and people should realise that it's not, we don't know everything, and that these things are out there for us to learn from as well.
It's about identifying what we don't know as well as what we know, because as soon as we realise what we don't know, that's when we get to the sort of legislation buffers, and that's when we need to push harder on stakeholders around us. So yeah,
definitely.
Maybe so. Aside from the book, which does detail actions for plan, design, procure, use, and learn, and what to do at each of these key points in the project. The Architects Declare is coming out with a really excellent and well illustrated design guide with lots of case studies. Letty has a net zero guide, and also they're coming out with a retrofit guide, and these are all really quite will be fresh off the press, and I would really highly recommend, with a lot of new knowledge and experience and case studies in them. So I'd really highly recommend looking at them. They are, I think all these publications are easy on the head and easy on the eye.
The Letty design guide, I would like to recommend if you haven't had a look at it. And Clara Bagnall-George and Claire Murray, 2 of the kind of forces behind it, were speaking this morning at the AJ Summit. They've had 40,000 downloads of that document, and it's a hefty document. I think it's 70 pages or so, in 100 countries, and that's just incredible. I mean, 5 years ago, you would really hard pressed to find. You could find books, but you couldn't find just accessible guidance. And ACAN is also doing, the Architects Climate Action Network, incredible work, and they have very active work streams on all these topics, and they welcome newcomers. You do not have to be expert, and you do not have to be in London, because it's all virtual at the moment, and it's all done with WhatsApp groups, and there's just an incredible amount of energy going into this. And for example, ACAN recently published a report on embodied carbon, which I never thought I would say this, but it's actually a riveting read, because it's very well illustrated and they get these complex topics across in a very straightforward accessible way. So it's no longer a question of where to turn for material, and there's so much good content out there now. So it's a bit overwhelming.
It is.
It's a journey, and I think, as Philippa said, you know, and I think what I learned from working on this book with Judit is that, you know, and we say this all the time, but actually doing it doesn't end at the practical completion of a project. You really need to go back and understand what works and what doesn't work, and you can learn a lot from that process.
Definitely.
Just going back to the benchmarks for a second. So I think the RIBA has really done a magnificent piece of work on this, because having sat on the Sustainable Futures Group for 6 years, about 10 years ago, at the time it was Alan Shingler who headed this group, and he came up with this term called we should have an award for buildings that stand the test of time. And actually, just recently, the RIBA has now asked to incorporate performance data about building in their award scheme. But I think it took maybe 15 years to get here, and successive chairs of the Sustainable Futures Group, including Gary Clark, have really very energetically pushed this agenda to bring performance and architectural quality together. So we don't just have amazing buildings that are wonderful for the occupants, but also they perform. And to have the evidence for both, it's something that was actually, when we were writing the book with Hattie and Sophie Pelsmakers, it was really hard to find examples that were able to evidence both. And maybe just one more publication to recommend, which is, you know, Sophie's Pelsmakers Environmental Pocketbook, which I think most architectural courses basically use as their fundamental manual for, and it's a very easily legible, and I'll send a link to it as well in a second. I just sent the Letty guide link for anyone who's.
That's great. I was going to say that Ania has asked for the link to that in the chat. We do send out afterwards as well, just in case anybody hasn't got access to the chat or doesn't take it down, a list of these links as well with the feedback form, so you will get them afterwards as well. So please, you know, don't worry about it if you forgot to get it out or get chucked out of the chat for any sort of reason. And we will put the link to Hattie and Judith's book and the pocketbook as well within it, because they are really good publications to use on a day-to-day basis, especially if you want to know more about it. I think we touched on POE, and I think, you know, post-occupancy evaluation, we touched on the award scheme as well, and we have changed the criteria for the awards to sort of lengthen the time that a building's in use before it can be submitted for the awards, and the sustainability data that's now has to be submitted for the awards process as well, which is sort of a step forward. But I think some things that these highlight sometimes is the lack of knowledge that we have about them, because these things change all the time, and how that sort of works, and people not really knowing the benefit of post-occupancy evaluation or being able to use it because a client won't pay for it. We sometimes find that hard because we're not getting paid for it, and we won't know the benefits of it. So I don't know if anybody wanted to sort of like just touch on post-occupancy evaluation, and we're going to go on to sort of talking specifically about small projects and domestic clients in a minute, and I think it would be good to link into that with how we can use that even on small projects as well. I don't know if anybody wants to start on that. I'm going to come to Judith.
Philippa, oh,
was it to me? Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, there's difficulties. I know Judith might pick up on the fact that, you know, I think in terms of the insurances side, that's been ironed out now, so people shouldn't really be worrying about that too much. But even just as a basic level, again, as we said about the questions at, you know, stage 7, sending a questionnaire out and just doing a walk around, it just should be something that we should see joy in, surely. I mean, the fact that we run away from our buildings, it isn't really a good sign, is it? We should, I know there's architects in the past that have gone down and just sat down on the floor always and just watched people walk past, and just seen how they interact with the building. I mean, there's a great, I think it's a marketing opportunity as well, to be honest, for practices that practices just miss out on, because there's nothing more desirable than seeing a building actually in use as opposed to CGI with just nothing, sparse. So I think it is something that we all need to push forward on. And in terms of, even if it just starts with a questionnaire to start off with, but I mean, there is the other side, which, I mean, depends on the scale of projects you're working with. But obviously we're seeing through things like a lot more to do with sensor technology. I mean, we've got it in our offices. We have air quality sensors that report to an app. So, there could be a way in the future that actually just data's collected for architects through just the operation system anyway, which could maybe get over the hurdle of us actually physically going back. But at the same time, I think, isn't there a bit of joy in going back to something you created? I just, it kind of baffles me a little bit why we're still not doing it.
Definitely. I think I worked on a project a very long time ago when I was sort of qualifying, and there was further stages of that project that I then went back and did. And it was great to have the meetings for the further stage in the building that I'd completed before, and really saw how that worked for me as well, being in a meeting in it, and it was just those things, and also seeing what doesn't work, so you don't make those mistakes in the future. And they're not necessarily mistakes, but they're things that you learn from. And I think that's always, it's good. I had a great experience with that. Not everybody obviously gets that experience, but if we do, then I think it is great to sort of to do that. Carry on, John. Could I just add? I think it's very interesting. You raised the point of the RIBA awards and the data that goes in, and I appreciate, not everyone on this call may feel that the work they do is work they want to put in for RIBA awards. We're a broad profession, and I totally respect that. But I just want to encourage people that, I was on the jury, well, it didn't meet last year, but the year before, looking particularly at the sustainability as well as design things. And I found it quite shocking, to be honest, that some big names who should have known a lot better didn't even bother to put in the information which was requested, some of which was fairly basic information which you would have to have for your building regulations application. And I think we need, as a whole profession, that there are some people doing fantastic work, but I'm ambitious that the whole profession comes up and skills up and starts to become much more knowledgeable, really, become literate about what these metrics mean. What does it mean to have so many kgs of CO2 per square metre per year in terms of the performance of the building, or kilowatt hours per square metre, the energy use and the carbon footprint. And I think just to get a level of literacy across the profession, we all know what £1,500 per square metre means. We've known it for yonks, but we should all be really talking these metrics to our clients, to one another, to understand where things sit. And I think it's partly through a post-occupancy evaluation, or, if one can't do that at an ambitious stage, one can at least get the bills back and see, okay, so it's used so many kilowatt hours of electricity, so much of gas, etc., to bring the baseline up so that we start to understand what's what. But I think the other great thing about a post-occupancy thing is, inevitably during a contract there are some things that work, some things that don't work, but the dust settles on all these things, and one can go back to a building. When I've been back, I've been very interested. You go back with a different mindset from the kind of contractual hassle sort of mindset, and you can just look at the thing. You can look at the light. You can learn from what you've done. You can if you can listen intelligently to the feedback. I think it's a great thing to do, and I think we should certainly be doing more of it. And I think particularly with a low energy building, it's so important that people understand how to use it, how to live in it. There've been lots of stories of passive house buildings where
you know, with social housing, people haven't understood the mechanical ventilation, heat recovery unit or whatever. And so I think there's a level of going back almost to sort of handhold with people to make sure that that people have got it and the building is running right. So I think this stage 7 stuff is really, really important for us to learn and feed back.
I've got a good example, which is this morning I was in a panel with 2 architects from Haworth Tompkins who have gone back to visit the Everyman Theatre in Liverpool, which won the Sterling Prize in 2014. So this is, I think they'd been wanting to do it for a while. They actually started this, they want to get up to speed on POE, so they decided to start with that building because they really wanted to know, did the natural ventilation work? Did the client like it? Did the actors like it? Did the audience like it? And so the two of the architects who weren't actually involved in designing the project went up to Liverpool, spent a couple of days. They actually told me they tried to interview as many people as possible during the interval of the play, and that particular building is wonderful because there's a facilities manager who's extremely switched on, and he spent a lot of time trying to get the building to work the way it was intended to work, and he's still there. And they came away with a resounding endorsement of the natural ventilation, particularly from the actors who value the fact that you don't have the quality of the kind of acoustics and sound in an environment like that versus something that's mechanically ventilated. And they have written up the report. I just had a look. It's not on their website yet, but Haworth Tompkins has a very a tab on their website called Climate, as they're one of the founding practices of Architects Declare. And there's a lot of really good information on there. And they are going to put this POE study up there soon, I would say in the next few weeks. I thought it was already up, next few days even. So that's a place to start. And they really, when they did this, they were trying to figure out, how do we do this? They want to know, how much time is it going to take for us to do this? Because they want to adapt it for other projects. So they really set out using the RIBA primer on POE, using the primer in Fionn Stevenson's book, to develop their own in-house approach to this, but an approach which isn't going to break the bank, because in this case, they're paying for it, the client's not paying for it. And so they wanted to make it as lean as possible. And I think they got to the point, they said today that, 2 architects spent a day a month for, I'm not quite sure how many months, to get quite a comprehensive understanding of the building. And some simple things like the wood floors that were put in, 7 years ago, they've aged beautifully. Other things like the rainwater harvesting system really didn't work the way it was intended. So, you learn things, and then you take that to the next project. Mm-hmm. I'll put this tab into the chat as well.
I just did it.
You did? Okay, great.
Yeah, that's great.
There's maybe one more point to add, like what designer would miss out on the lessons, on the user interaction lessons learned from their projects? There is no design profession in the world that wouldn't value this kind of feedback as an inspiration for design. I mean, imagine how much time we spend trying to get all those details right, the product's good, the way the building goes together correct, the energy consumption right. Surely the best way to learn is to look at it. And I think there's a tendency in the industry to try and bury bad news, whereas actually it's anything that doesn't work is the source of new knowledge. And that is really the essence of it. I think without trying to flog the book too much, we did put in huge amounts of lessons learned from the building performance evaluation projects funded by Innovate UK and other feedback studies that have been carried out by other projects. So it is a summary about what our assumptions can be as architects and what then happens in real life. So people don't have to start from scratch and just tell the stories of how to learn from feedback. And I think that when we talk to the architects who've submitted case studies, so they feel empowered by by this knowledge, and they feel that they stand on better ground, not just having more knowledge, but also they have the data to demonstrate what works better and what's really worth investing in. And no, there's nothing like having the data on the table on the day at the meeting when you're being queried as part of a value engineering exercise, and you can just say, sorry, if you do this, that's going to happen. Is that really what you want? This is the evidence. So
I'll just add one more thing. I had a very revealing moment recently in terms of post-occupancy, which is I was interviewing Annalie Ritchie's of Mikhail Ritchie's on my AJ podcast, Climate Champions. And I asked her, this was maybe the second question in the interview, what was your light bulb moment in terms of your sustainability journey? Because it's not a practice that's known for until recently for sustainable design. They're very much a design-led practice. So what tipped it for you? And she said the post-occupancy work on a housing project they did in Suffolk 10 years ago, which was undertaken and paid for by Bureau Happold, and understanding, the knowledge that they gained from actually understanding what was working and what wasn't working changed everything for them. And, you feel in control. Harry Paticus is on my next episode, has said exactly the same thing. He said, I just felt like I didn't understand what thermal bridges, exactly how they worked. I needed to know how my buildings perform. So in his case, he went to do the Passive House course. But it's a journey and you have to start somewhere, but it goes fast.
It is, and it's those light bulb moments as well, as you say, that make sort of that massive difference to want to know more and learn more. I say to my children all the time about, it's not a mistake, you'll learn from it, you won't do it again. And us as adults need to practice that, and architects need to practice that going forward as well. And this leads us in, we've had a great question. So Adriana has asked, could you suggest, please, a way to collect this data for small projects and residential retrofits? Or ways to approach clients about post-occupancy evaluation. I think that leads us on nicely to sort of smaller projects as well, and how to do that. And maybe having this data is a way of, engineering those conversations, because you know more about it. John, I don't know whether you probably deal with sort of smaller clients, and you were your own smaller client in your own house as well. So how to sort of broach those conversations and how to do it.
Sure. Well, I think the first space is that, as I was trying to say earlier, I think if you can get the, and I don't think this happens across the industry at all, but if you can get the gas bills, if it's gas, or hopefully it's not, get the electric bills, and you can get that data, each month, ideally, you just get a reading. I think that's just a basic layer of data. I think I could also just give a name check, since Hattie's mentioned the monitoring of that Suffolk project. Professor Lubo Yankovic did that work, and he's based at Zero Carbon Lab. And it's not actually that expensive to get some little gizmos that can sit on the wall and measure temperatures, measure output, and so forth. And of course, it's horses for courses. If you're on a project where you can put sensors built into the construction at every layer, and you can measure things, that's fantastic. But I don't think we all need to do that at all. But I think just to get some basic data on the energy use is the key thing. And if you can get it broken down with a smart metering system, then that's fantastic. But I think it's if you haven't done it before, I would say just start small. Start with some basic metrics which are easy to get hold of, and then as you get more into it, it's lovely to see how much PV is generated on a particular day, how much hot water is generated. And, certainly in terms of living in this zero carbon house here, above me, we've got solar panels on the roof. And it's been fascinating for me, just if I can tell a little story about this monitoring, because we thought when the sun goes to its minimum on the 21st of December, that is when the house would be most stretched. But we've now got, we didn't quite monitor from day one, but we've got, I think, 9 years of data now. And we found that, in fact, it's never been that cold in December. It's February. every year, almost every year, which has been the coldest. But by February, the sun path is coming up, and we're March now, the equinox, the sun is blazing. But even by February, when you get a really cold night, you've got a clear sky, and when you get a clear sky, you get a lot of solar, and so that's really helpful in terms of passive solar gain if you've got your windows facing the right way, and in terms of solar hot water, it can be -4 outside and you're generating solar hot water at 65 degrees C. It's still so counterintuitive, but that's what happens. And I think if you're able to start measuring the data and build up a picture, and some of this, we work intuitively as designers, don't we? But if we start to amass this body of knowledge, then I think it's really helpful to start designing with that in mind. So I would say, start small, and you'll get hooked, and you'll want to know more.
And perhaps it's something that we introduce into fee letters at the beginning. It's just a clause, just to say, look, we're really interested in how your building performs at the end. Could we just have a look at your annual bills equivalent or something? Don't show us the cost or whatever, but just show us the energy that was used. And therefore, again, it's at stage 0, isn't it? You've got the buy-in from the client to then send that back to you at the end, because it's always more difficult.
It's a really good idea.
Later.
And for smaller projects, it is really just a follow-up visit done. You can just say, I'll come over, let's have a chat about how things work, and you look at all the things that you thought were tricky at the time, have a walk around, listen to what the client says about what's working and what's not working. I noticed that someone in the question list was saying, well, the advice is not of our PI insurers not to do this, and I think there's a difference between large projects and small projects. So for large projects, this is an undertaking that takes a little bit more time. Visiting the building is more of an official act. There are different contract types. So if you're in a design and build contract, you effectively don't have as much influence on the outcome. So you take a different approach. But even in the large projects, if you start the discussion at the beginning with the client, you can sign that appointment for the building performance work early on in a project as part of a different contract. And sometimes it's actually more useful to do that, because you get, even if it's a design and build project, you get to stay on the outside of the project as a performance champion for the building. Or you can assign a different team member or a different practice member to do that role while you're actually novated to the contractor as part of a design and build. On smaller projects, it can be a lot more informal, and if you think about it as an exercise for learning and improving. Sorry, I can see my voice. Then it doesn't have to be extremely formal, and you have to judge it on a project by project basis. But the most important thing to agree it at the beginning of the project, and just ideally have it in writing. If it's a small project, if you start monitoring these aspects of the building early on, and you have all the design information, it doesn't cost much to go and visit the building, and most likely your client will appreciate the call and will definitely tell you all the things that don't work for them. And another thing from the insurer's perspective is, in a way, this is a way to cut future risk for people, and I think the RIBA is having this conversation with multiple insurers to try and see whether, for people who do conduct these evaluations post completion, actually they present a lower PI risk than those who don't, because you're more likely to learn from mistakes rather than repeating them project after project.
Definitely. And I think we did an event earlier today about fees, and we discussed about different levelling of fees and what's included for that fee, and being real open and honest with your clients about the different services and things that are, you know, part of that sort of fee. And, you know, as Philippa said, putting that in the initial, you know, post-occupancy visit to sort of evaluate the project and what's done. With any project that we do, you know, that's not architectural, we evaluate its performance in terms of, you know, an event that we do, we evaluate to make sure that that event's been done. And why shouldn't we do it with a building as well? Because it's, you know, somebody's life that they're living in and things like that. So and that's how we learn. So definitely. We've had another question as well in the chat about which is, you know, and I'm sure you'll all have a sort of an opinion on this, and what do the panelists think the government should do to reduce our carbon footprint?
Can I start on this one?
Go for it.
You know, there is a bit of an elephant in the room when it comes to this conversation, is that a lot of smaller practices work in the retrofit sector. The requirements for retrofitting buildings in terms of performance are minimal. And even for new buildings, the performance requirements are really theoretical only. So in current building regulations, we only measure theoretical performance. That means we look at buildings and how they perform under theoretical conditions, and assuming that they were largely constructed as imagined when you design them. So yes, there is an airtightness test, but aside from that, there is precious little power for any level of accountability in the process. And this ultimately is disempowering, disenfranchising architects, because we have no legal power to enforce the quality that we have envisaged in our design work, unless we are extremely prescriptive in our contracts. That means you have to put in the performance requirements, and that you have to detail to an extremely high level, and basically it has to be in the employer's requirements. And which is one of the reasons why passive house buildings tend to perform so much better, because there's such an intense scrutiny of the contractual documents and the employer's requirements. But this is the level of scrutiny we need for all buildings, not just passive house buildings, and we need to measure really what matters and not theoretical performance. And you know, I hear it from 46 member organizations that architects are feeling increasingly disassociated from their end product. So going back and getting this data ourselves empowers us to show the quality of and the value of our work to our clients, and we can communicate it through the RIBA back to policymakers. Hope that makes sense.
Definitely. Thanks, Julia. I don't know if anybody else has any comments on that. But what
I was just going to add that they need to get rid of VAT on retrofit.
Absolutely.
And there is a petition that's being circulated by ACAN, so I suggest every single person on this call sign that, because it's ridiculous.
Oh, another link.
Yeah, another link.
Another link.
Absolutely, yes. And go on, Hattie.
I wanted to mention, because I had the privilege of interviewing Ed Masria as part of the AJ Summit, and he's the one who just won the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal. And he's not an architect; he's a campaigner for low energy buildings that he started about 15 years ago, and has had a tremendous impact with his organization called Architecture 2030. So, you know, and he's based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I asked him, I said, you know, here in the UK, the big challenge is retrofit. And how are we going to deal with retrofit? Because if that could be legislated or in some way, that would have such an impact. And he said, oh, it's so easy. You just, you know, every time a building has to be repaired on a kind of 15, 20-year cycle, you require an energy upgrade. And triggering, I guess here we call it consequential improvements. He made it sound so simple. I don't think it's quite that simple, but I'd be interested to know what the other panelists think about that?
Well, I'll come back to that one if I may.
Okay.
I mean, it's a very important point. But if I could just come back to the to the question that's been asked about government, because I think this is a central government. And Becky, can you make sure we come back to Hattie's point that she's made?
But
so
that
well
would
there.
be sort of somehow legislating, you know, a policy change that required that kind of improvement. I don't know, when a building is sold or something.
Yeah. No, I think it'd be a great idea. But I think on the what can government do? I think this the retrofit question, you know, that you've both raised, I think is absolutely crucial. And people may have seen that this Monday, the Environmental Audit Committee brought out a report saying that there are 19 million homes that need to get up to scratch. You know, that's only to EPC C. I think they should all get to EPC A, which would mean that we've actually got 28 million homes, and there's a huge amount of work to be done on that. The funding needs to be brought forward by government, but I think just at the moment, people may be aware that the new Part L, the so-called Future Home Standard, is out for consultation. It's been out for consultation for a year, some would say. Perhaps it's been out for consultation for 6 years since the Code for Sustainable Homes was withdrawn, and there's been nothing back. But could I just commend, and we can perhaps put in the chat again, Letty, those who aren't familiar with it, the London Energy Transition Initiative, Letty, LETI, have brought out a document just in the last few days with a sort of template to respond to government. So I think the biggest thing that we can do as a profession is to keep on reminding each other and our clients and the government that in the UK, 46% of UK CO2 comes from buildings. On the figures I have, which are the ACAM figures, 28% from operating buildings and 18% embodied. And I think there's such a huge amount of energy is being guzzled by our buildings. And if we can literally reduce down the fuel bills from to 10% or 5% or perhaps 3% of what they are, we can make such a massive impact. And so I think the more conversations we can have at stage zero and throughout, you know, with the consultants we're working with the contractors, just to raise awareness that this is a massive issue. And I think continually to put pressure on government that we must have, you know, we must raise the bar so that the minimum standard is much, much higher than, in my view, than the Future Home Standard is suggesting at the moment. And I think that will have a massive impact. So, you know, let's all do that. And, you know, I think we can really hold the government's feet to the fire on it, really.
Mm-hmm. Just on your point, Hattie, in terms of the consequential, you know, changes over time, I suppose that does sound like a great idea. I suppose, but it would also be good if it was coupled with the reductions for the VAT to make it more affordable to make these changes, and also a massive push for skills upgrade of the trades people across the UK. Because I mean, I'm looking into a retrofit for my own house. There is it is, you know, like there's tumbleweed of tradespeople who are ready to take on an eco retrofit, and they would probably put a building a good amount of risk because it's new to them. And I know that the Green Register are doing a lot of work, and they've got a I think it's called Future Proof, and they're training up builders down in Bristol area, which great, but there's so much good stuff going in Bristol. We need to spread it all the way across the nation. So I think there'll probably be a three-parter. Is yes, we should have these conditional changes and, you know, upgrade every time we need to do maintenance on the house. But yeah, the VAT, lose that, and also couple it with making sure that there's the tradespeople ready to help us with it when that comes around.
Definitely. And I suppose that leads us on to well, we've got a question from James in the chat, so I'll go to that first. With a growing quantity of council-owned housing being delivered, thankfully, as passive house, the education of tenants on how to use these building machines is key. Is there a performer for this to pass on to council tenants? I don't know the answer. I don't know whether any of our panelists do today, or whether it's something.
Yes, I can talk to that a bit if you like. I think there isn't a pro forma as such, but I think the work that the Passive House Trust has done in this area is really valuable. I think there's John Palmer has done a lot of technical work on it, and I think if you're not familiar with their work, there's a great wealth of information there. And I think I'm working in this area actually for Herefordshire County Council at the moment, looking at standards for their 2,500 new homes over the next 10 years. And I think I think it needs an approach at many different levels, really, because if you're looking at council house tenants, they come in all shapes and sizes. Some may be shared ownership people who who are able to take on some of the maintenance of their house themselves. Some may be at a stage where, and I think historically, when we look back, a number of councils and social landlords have said, OK, we've got to put in extra maintenance resource for these passive houses because people don't know how to change the filters in their mechanical ventilation heat recovery units. And so that's been a sort of added on cost. I think there are lots of different ways of approaching this. I mean, I think we need to get to a stage where it's as simple that people understand how to defrost a fridge or whatever. They need to be able to be explained how to change a filter. It's a very simple thing. If you've never done it, you just pull out a drawer, you take a new filter that's come through the post, you drop it in, and there you are. So I think there's a whole level of learning as people learn to live in these zero carbon, these passive house homes, how to do it. And I think that the question really points up that the education of tenants, and indeed, it's not just tenants. I think there are only owner occupiers who live in passive house things who have gone through a learning curve, and others who perhaps as part of a POE have sort of been using it one way and then they suddenly realise, oh yes, perhaps we need to do it another way. So I think there is a lot of knowledge out there. I think the Passive House Trust would be a great starting point for it, but I think it's a bit of an octopus that covers a lot of different issues. So perhaps other panelists have got other things to say about it.
I think we did the old O&M manuals. Us as we're at the end of a job, we're always having to put those together, and actually a building user manual in that sense is something that needs to be thought about in terms of that. And if we're designing to that scale and there's things that need to be done by the house occupant, that maybe we should be thinking about that as well. Definitely. And to have have a QR code on each of the things so that people can look at a video of how to do. Oh, I missed that.
I was just going to say, go ahead, John. I'll go after you.
Sorry, I was just saying, if you have what I've been talking to Passive House Council tenant sort of discussion about is you just have a QR code on the piece of kit and people can then zap it and they can look a little video of what they need to do. And I think there are lots of ways we can use the new tech to communicate this so that it does get actually understood and embedded. Thank you, Hattie.
Yeah. That would be amazing. I was just going to say that there are a number of architects who have tried to tackle this over the past few years, and if it's all now down to a QR code, that makes it even simpler. But one is Justin Bear of Bear Architects, and he has put together very user-friendly manuals for clients, and we've actually reproduced one in our book because his are just so clear and beautiful, with very clear step-by-step what you need to look out for and what you need to do, all on kind of an A4 page. So I don't know if it's on his website. It might well be. Bear Architects.
We'll try and find the link to that as well so we can put that up. I'll move on to that. Well, we've discussed sort of small projects and domestic clients in quite a sort of, quite a lot of length. But I think the one thing we didn't touch on was the value of what we do and bring. And then we didn't touch on materials as well. And I think that's a really key sort of area because that's some, people ask about insulation a lot and things like that, and there's been a question in the chat as well about sort of unnecessary environmental wishes, and those things come into what we're doing again and again, and they're not seen as a value to the building. They're not seen as, you know, and they often get taken out as our value engineering, really. But, you know, we shouldn't engineer out value, is what's Philippa, I don't know whether you've got anything to
yeah, sure. So we've actually done quite a bit of work on this at Thrive, because we're just so frustrated with, you know, all the different environmental data performance certificates that come in all different shapes and sizes and different levels. Some of them consider sort of materials from, you know, being quarried up to sort of gate and not the whole life considerations. So we I actually went up to the Lighthouse in Glasgow, and they've got an amazing sustainable materials library where you can actually pick up the materials and look at them, engage with them, which is just something that they're not around that I know of around down south. So we asked them what questions they ask manufacturers to be able to determine what materials are sustainable and what aren't. And they were really great. They shared the questions with us, and then we sort of topped and tailed it with, you know, learning about the Declare label. It's all part of the Living Futures Institute, picking out red list materials and asking manufacturers whether they contain any of those. I think even that list doesn't seem to cover all the breadths of nasties that we want to avoid. And then other bits that we've just picked up from conferences, etc. And then we've sent this every time we have a lunch and learn CPD, and, you know, we've all experienced them. We would send at the end, we would send this questionnaire and say, look, you know, probably before we consider you as part of our specification, could you provide the answers to these questions? And we formulated them into a bit of a materials passport, because I think we've all heard about materials passports. I don't think we've seen one physically. I know it's been talked about in terms of models and sort of digital twins, etc. But we just thought we're just going to just jump ahead and just try and see what one might look like, just to make it easier for you know, the guys in the project teams who are specifying, just to be able to go to a folder and just see that we've done a little prelim checkup in terms of the sustainability credentials. And I appreciate that we've probably got a lot of small practices on the call, and so there's not going to be a team that does this for you. But I would say, you know, we'd be happy to share some of the questions that we ask, and it's just a case of questioning the suppliers a lot more, and then that builds up our knowledge and understanding of materials, and then we can use that to really fight for these materials when it comes to VE. We can really say, you know, when the contractor says, oh, I've found this one, looks similar, it's cheaper, but it's like, okay, but have you done this level of research behind, you know, like
that is so brilliant. That is really brilliant, Philippa.
So can you demonstrate, you know, that you've avoided the red list materials? Can you do this? Can you do that? And in that should demonstrate to the client what the value is of that material, because, you know, you can say, right, well, you're going to avoid, if this is for, I don't know, a future housing scheme, and that is one area where I just think the health and well-being thing really hasn't been considered in terms of healthy design principles, is resi, because I personally, if I was going to pick a new build home and there were two, one next to the other, one of them is not going to exacerbate any sort of asthmatic issues, and one is, and I knew I would go for the one that was going to have healthier air quality. And you just think, surely that'd be a differentiator for house builders. So yeah, I think just expanding our material understanding would really help us lock in these nicer, healthier materials. And obviously we know about embodied carbon, we're talking about embodied carbon, but there's also the health and well-being piece. We found that well is actually quite, you know, health and well-being and well is actually a gateway conversation to then introduce more sustainability in. And stealthy, you know, there's, you know, in incorporating things like timber and, you know, wood fibre board, or, you know, things like straw, you know, natural materials generally do have good healthy principles as well. Obviously, you've got to consider things like formaldehyde, but on the whole, you'll find they should go hand in hand quite nicely.
There's a really good contractual trick. that if you do a full operational energy use forecast, and we describe this in the book, what you should do is accompany this with a list of all the properties of your building that this forecast depends on when your building is in use. So that the fact that, and if you put the clause into your builder's contract that if they change any of these ring-fenced materials or products or specifications for the building, then they have to recalculate the energy model to demonstrate that the building still works. And you could use the same for embodied carbon. We used this very successfully on the Keynsham Civic Centre project. It was the brainchild of Max Fordham's this little clause, and it was the architects working on this project said it was the easiest project they ever worked on because they didn't spend endless meetings in endless value engineering meetings arguing the impossible. So yeah, metrics do have a role to play.
Yeah, I should just add as well, we have actually worked with the MBS to be able to add these additional filters. So if you do look and have a look at materials on MBS, you will see now that you can filter based on embodied carbon and other factors that weren't there previously. So yeah, hopefully we should get this integrated through the main channels as well as us all sort of, you know, battling as individuals.
Definitely. I've realised the time, it's 18 minutes past 5, so we've got, you know, half an hour left. So I thought the last sort of question or last sort of subject area I'd look at was skills gap and sort of external consultants and when's the sort of best time to use them, because, you know, we have a lot of sole practitioners or smaller practices that come to these meetings. We can't be everything. We can't have, you know, all of that knowledge together. So, you know, how to use consultants in order to gain that knowledge and how to sort of lessen that skills gap that we may have within the industry at the moment. I don't know if anybody would like to sort of start on that one.
I can give you an idea of the things that we've been writing. I don't want to say book again. But, so, I mean, first of all, obviously nobody has to do everything, but some of these things are actually really simple. So the energy metrics are not that hard, like kilowatt hours. If you understand a little bit about how it's represented and how to track it, it's really quick to grasp. And so I would definitely encourage people to get familiar with the metrics in the first place, because it's all that you need to know. And you don't need to understand the details of it. You just need to know what questions to ask from your consultant in terms of what type of energy model that they need is it that they need to deliver, and what assumptions need to be behind that. And you need to be aware that there's a difference between calculating performance for compliance, and the calculating performance as in forecasting something is a completely different ballgame. And yes, many consultants will not want to do the latter, and it takes a little bit of arm twisting to do that. But it's possible to do it from the start. You work much better together. If you don't even have an M&E engineer, I mean, if the job is really small, then using the PHPP software, even if you don't end up meeting the criteria, is a really good introduction to how to balance some of the factors that contribute to consumption, so to energy consumption itself. So I would say it's a lot easier than you think. It's probably a little bit more complicated than you'd hope, but it's really worth getting into. And the second thing is that always the best thing to do is, if you don't know something and you don't have the time to look it up, yes, do use a consultant, but learn from what the consultant does. So the best thing to do, architects are fantastic at learning on the job. And there's nothing like someone showing you the thing. You can then repeat it yourself at on the next project. But the important thing is document the benefit of it and see if it really works, because you don't want to learn something that's actually not working out in practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Definitely. And we always say, you know, oh, the M&E engineer does that. I'm not sure how to do that, you know, and we can learn to do these things ourselves. That's
because we'll only end up just feeding information to someone else, and actually gathering that information together is half the battle. So we may as well actually just do it ourselves, because we own the models, we own the design. So yeah, it just makes sense that we carry it through if we can and when we can.
But you know, not all.
Yes, I would. Go on.
There you go.
I would totally endorse the bit about the Passive House Planning Package. PHPP is Passive House Planning Package, for those who aren't familiar with it. And it's, you know, when no one had done Passive House in this country, everyone was very scared of it. But, you know, a lot of people have now done it. If you've never done it before, then I would say, and perhaps the engineer you work with has never done it before, I would say find an engineer who's done it. And all you need to do is put in the different parameters of the building, you know, the size of the windows, et cetera, and I think it's a really good piece of learning for architects to see, not just to be given the result, but to actually sit with someone, you know, an engineer who knows it. I think would be delighted to give you a little masterclass on it, and you can see, you know, if you move this window around, or if you move the building orientation around, you can see in real time how the thing changes. And so, and as Judith says, even if you're not actually going to get accreditation, or you're not quite getting to the standard, I think it's so much more it's so much more relevant for any building that has a sort of, you know, a lowish energy aspiration, because it will model something that we know from experience, and from Dr. Wolfgang Feist's experience over decades now, is going to give you a much truer picture of what the thing is. So, you know, go and sort of get it under your skin, the Passive House Planning Package metrics and how it works. You know, you don't necessarily need to buy it for the office and learn how to use it, although that would be great if you feel you want to. But I think it's a sort of, you know, a little masterclass with someone who knows it. You can learn a lot from. And the sort of, perhaps the primer to read even before that is on the Passive House Trust website. There's a thing called Passive House Rules of Thumb, which gives, you know, some good learning, I think, that's been distilled.
And also there's a direct link from SketchUp, right? So I don't know if you use that, John, but you can really interactively output information from a SketchUp model now into PHPP, which it just makes it so much more usable for architects.
Absolutely. And then the next stage is the ribbon which goes on it, which will give you all your embodied carbon as well. You're ready to graduate to that. And to be fair, so there are other software, like Design Builder also has a very good link, and also offers all kinds of analysis on top of that. So, you know, I don't want to be seen definitely promoting a single 3D package, but an analysis package. But yeah, there are different platforms, and it's really worth exploring them. Definitely, there are the tools out there. Definitely, you know, the FCB carbon calculator as well. The carbon counts is really good. RIBA are developing their own sort of carbon capture tool as well that's coming out soon. You know, look at the climate challenge. Definitely look at the climate challenge. The principles and everything that are in that are laid out really sort of easily to see, and they're for any practice size to sign up to, and the principles to apply. And it is all about having a go. I think that is it. It all starts somewhere, and it is about having a go and applying those principles. So definitely. I think, you know, we've got 5 minutes to go, and I want to ask you all, you know, a takeaway today, basically, for anybody who's watching. And if you could all, you know, what is your key takeaway for the people that are listening today to start their journey towards, you know, making sustainable architecture work? John, if I come to you first, because you're at the bottom of my screen. Okay, I'm put on the spot. Well, I was wondering about this one, but I think I'd like to leave you with an image of James Bond. We've not been able to see James Bond in the cinema, and he's hardly an icon of low carbon, but the 007 for me is quite a nice metric. The first 0 is we've got to aim for net zero carbon. Okay, we've got to, on every project, you may not quite be able to get there, but the first 0 carbon. The second 0 is RIBA stage 0. That is where we can have a massive impact. And the 7, of course, is our IBA stage 7, the learning. So there you are. If you remember one thing, 007. Thank you. That's amazing, John. I will remember that for the rest of my life now. That's brilliant. Thank you. Hattie, if I come to you next.
I love that 007. My son watched every single film, I don't know how many times, and I'll remember that, and that is so true. I was just gonna come back to kind of what I said at the beginning, which is to keep the holistic view in mind. I just think, it's very easy to get lost in the detail here, and you've got to keep stepping back and thinking, does this make sense? And yes, you have to look at the numbers and the metrics and understand them, and look at whole life carbon, both operational and embodied, but just keep the big picture in mind. That, I guess, that's my main, and go back and visit, of course.
Philippa, if I come to you next.
Yeah, sure. Obviously, I echo the last two as well. And then also, I just say, get informed and ask questions. You don't realise how much impact one person can have if they just ask questions. If you have a CPD and you just think, oh, I don't know, what's their processing like? Are they using renewable energy? Ask that question. Be the difficult person in the room, because they will go back and they'll say, oh, I had a really strange day today. Someone asked me this question, and then it will ripple through. So I just say, and that just applies across life, just generally, in our own personal lives when faced with this crisis. Ask questions. Yeah.
Definitely. And then last but not least, Judit.
I think, are you saying, Philippa, just be difficult? Don't be afraid of being difficult.
Yeah. Be confident enough to be difficult. I think
just
that's it.
I think we touched on all these points before, but start from the beginning. Know what you want to achieve from the start. Discuss it with the client. Follow it through. Make sure it goes into the contract and follow it up. And design for lifespan. Remember, it is just about life cycle extension. We want buildings or our work to last. If our specification doesn't, our specifications have to help the building last longer, or be demountable if it's a short lifespan building. And be realistic about lifespan, and also design by lifespan. So if you have a build-up and you glue it all together, and the middle of the build-up has a 15-year lifespan in your 60-year lifespan building, so just be practical.
I would like to add one more thing, which I'm surprised hasn't come up, and it just occurred to me, and that is to collaborate with experts, which is slightly different from hiring an expert. If you develop relationships with experts, then you're in a position to quickly ring them up if you need to know something without having to actually hire them to do the whole shebang for you. But this is all a process. So find the people who work the same way you want to work, and hire them in when, however much you need them, but just develop those relationships, because this does require, and we haven't touched on landscape at all. We talk a lot about engineering, but we need to understand all these things as the architect. And so get the people around the table who are best suited to the challenge at hand.
And can I add, is to work with universities. So
yes,
establish links with universities, hire their graduates, and just build a relationship, because universities are really actively doing research in this, and they are very happy to support practices, especially if there's an opportunity for work for their students in the long run. And I'd just like to add one last thing, Colombo style, is that we didn't touch on overheating today, but I would say it's an absolutely essential aspect of design. It's something that resilience to overheating is going to become increasingly critical. So make sure you work with the experts to design buildings that are more resilient to overheating.
Definitely, and that applies to all scale of work, that is. I mean, nobody wants their kitchen overheating, their kitchen extension or whatever with that massive big roof like you've put in, which is great. So definitely it applies to all scales of work. I just want to say a big thank you from me for this fantastic talk. We've had some great comments in the chat saying thank you, there's things that they've never known. We've taken something away, and that's what all these sessions are about. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to everybody who came today. We've got the next practice clinic in a couple of weeks' time, but also if anybody's interested in the Passive House, we've got some CPDs on the RIBA Academy on Passive House at the moment if you'd like to do some initial learning, and we've posted loads of links in the chat. But if you don't see any of the chat or don't get any of the links, they will come out on the feedback form, which will come out over the next couple of days. I've also posted the link to the book code discount, which gives you £7 off the book, but it is capital E, capital P, capital B 7, just for anybody who didn't get it in the chat. Okay, thank you everybody, and we'll see you next time.